So I grew up convinced that journalism could change the world. So that's me when I was 7, when I published my first newspaper, every day for a whole month during the summer vacation. Written on the cardboard my father's laundered shirts came back in. I knew early on that newspapers could right a wrong, they could expose an injustice. And my screen heroes only convinced me that this should be my life's mission. So there was Woodward and Bernstein exposing Watergate. There was the always fair Lou Grant protecting Los Angeles at the Tribune. So when I did become a journalist, sure, I took on a billionaire pornographer. I proudly fought off legal threats from a religious cult I was investigating. But if I'm really honest, I never did right a serious wrong. I never took a real risk to expose injustice, to inform in a daring way. Not real risks of the types journalists like Lydia Cacho take. Cacho was working in Mexico for a newspaper when she uncovered a child prostitution ring in Cancun. She wrote a book, Demons of Eden, in which she named names. She said there was a hotel owner, John Sukarkuri, who was involved. She said he was protected by a powerful businessman. So 8 months after this book came out, she was taken by police, abducted, they had no warrant, driven away, sexually assaulted, taken to a pier overlooking the ocean, told she was going to jump in and die there. So let me just read you Lydia Cacho's account of her abduction from Index on Censorship. In the back of the car, this heavy-set, paunch-bellied man who reeks of onions pushes up against me. He orders me to put my hands behind my back. I obey. He pulls his gun out of his holster and says, "You like messing with men, don't you?" He takes his gun, a semi-automatic, and he holds it up to my lips. "If you cough, it'll go off," he says. I close my eyes. "Weren't you supposed to be really ballsy? Weren't you a big mouth? The boss is going to finish you." He then assaults her. "See, this is what you get for making up stories about the boss messing with little girls." As I look out the window, images of my family come to mind, of my mother laughing and hugging me, a dinner party at my grandparents' house. That's the way it goes, I think. I'm 42, and I'm going to die in the company of a couple of police agents. Well, Lydia Cacho didn't die. Suddenly a phone call comes through, and the police change their plans. Luckily, her boyfriend and her work colleagues found out what was happening. They called Amnesty International. They called the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York. They informed the media. Pressure was put on the governor. It was becoming an international story. So the word came through, the police had to change their plans. A day or so later, Lydia Cacho was released, unharmed. So John Sukarkuri, he's now facing criminal charges in Mexico. She still faced death threats. Well, let me tell you the story about Abdul Karim al-Kawani, a journalist in Yemen. When he became editor of the newspaper Al-Shura, he published articles looking into corruption in the oil industry, about government officials lining their pockets. They didn't like this. He was harassed, he was beaten, he was arrested, jailed a number of times. His newspaper was closed. He faced death threats, but he didn't learn the lesson. So in June 2007, during one of these raids to arrest him, he was beaten in his house, and his 6-year-old daughter, Ebba, she was slapped unconscious. Now, that's not an easy thing for a 6-year-old to take, especially when then you find out your father's been jailed again, this time for 6 years. This is Ebba.
أنا اسمي زادي كذيبة خياني موافقة إن أنا أصور. الأول بس البار أختي جاوبت قالت الحين كهرباء أختي فتحت لهم طلبهم دقوا قلت لهم قالوا أنا عنش فتحت لهم دخلوا دهفوني على طول للغرفة كفزوا له سطره يعني دقوا راسي بالأرض يعني دقهم زبطون بعد كانوا يدهفوا من واحد لواحد بعد قدوا في الدراج تفعل كذا يعني أختي تطلع لما أدخل له قل له لا تكتبش يقول لي لا تخافي. المرة الثانية بزيت الأوراق طرحتها في شنطتي كان يدور لقي في شنطتي دخلت له مرة ثانية وقال لا تكتبش قال لي تخافي.
So this video makes you angry, doesn't it? It makes you want to go out and do something. Well, that's what saved Al-Kawani. Other people in other countries wanted to do something. This video was made by a Yemeni human rights group, this simple, raw video. The group, the Sisters Arabic Forum for Human Rights, they were trained by an organization called Witness. And the video was put on YouTube. It went out through the social networks. It caught the attention of the US State Department. Pressure was then put on the authorities. It went from being a local issue to an international issue. Al-Kawani received unexpectedly a presidential pardon. He was released from jail in Sana'a. And when he came out, he said he felt the world was on his side. To quote him, "I wasn't alone to face the ordeal, so I felt strong." So today I want to talk about how we all can help protect brave journalists like these. And it's not going to take very much effort. It's all really about helping shine a light on their work, on making them visible internationally, so that those who oppress them don't feel they can do so with impunity. Now, I'll explain in a minute exactly how, but first I want to look at what newspapers mean to us today. So you can just ask the hive mind. Get Google to finish a search query based on what everybody else is searching for. So you know now that Google thinks newspapers are dying. They're dead. They're obsolete. What about investigative journalism? No doubt about that. It's dead. But if newspapers are dying in our world of iPad apps and blogs, that's not the case in far-flung places, from Mexico to the Philippines. They still there serve a vital role in holding authorities to account. In fact, in places like that, it's not so much newspapers that are dying. Too often it's newspaper journalists who are dying in the course of reporting what's really happening, of asking those difficult questions. They're being murdered cold-bloodedly. From criminal gangs to corrupt politicians to drug dealers, business bosses, paid thugs. And that's news we don't get to hear. Let me just give you a few examples quickly. You won't have heard of Ale Biabenin, a journalist in Belarus. He ran the Charter 97 website. Now, he got a lot of harassment. The website held the Belarus authorities up to account. He was beaten, at one stage almost to death, by a gang with links to the KGB. Biabenin was found hanging from a noose in his summer house just outside Minsk. The authorities said it was a suicide, but no suicide note was found, and his friends said he was in good spirits that day. In fact, later that night he was due to go to the cinema with them. Nobody's been charged. Biabenin leaves a wife and 2 sons. Well, let me tell you somebody else you won't have heard of. Alberto Graves Chakusunga from Rwanda, 32-year-old reporter on Radio Despertar, hosted a phone-in show. Now, the radio station has been a bit hostile to the ruling MPLA. Neighbours found him in his house in Rwanda, shot dead in the back of the head. Earlier that day, he'd taken his pregnant wife to hospital, where later on she gave birth to a baby boy, their 4th child. Nobody's been charged. Or let me tell you about Vasil Khiemyentiev from Ukraine. Newspaper editor, started investigating more local corruption. Went missing. His family found a boat on which he'd been on a sailing trip. It had his mobile phone, it had his key, but no sign of him. The Interior Minister said most likely he'd been murdered by regional bosses, regional politicians, who didn't like the fact that he was getting too close. Again, no arrests. And there's Saeed Hamid Nouri, a TV anchor from Radio Television Afghanistan, stabbed to death. You won't have heard of Safa Abdul Hamid, an Iraqi TV journalist, shot dead as he left for work. Riyad al-Sarai, a presenter at Al-Iraqiyya, gunned down outside his home in Baghdad. The list of journalists who've been killed who you haven't heard of goes on and on. And what's really troubling is these just aren't the most gruesome examples I could find. I haven't trawled a database. Here's the real news. All these journalists have been killed in the last month. They're all footnotes to stories that you won't have heard about. It's just another month when police or criminals or politicians feel free to eradicate journalists who are just getting inconvenient. That's not good enough. That's not something I can live with and still call myself a journalist. These are huge scandals, and I think we can no longer ignore them. If you're killed simply for reporting the news, that should be news. Everybody should know. The wider world should be asking questions. It's the only way to stop more assassinations, more death threats, more acts of violence, just because someone's saying what's going on locally. And the scale of these extrajudicial murders, that's shocking, just to look at a few numbers. So according to the International News Safety Institute, more than 1,000 journalists were killed in the decade 2006 just because of their work. Astonishingly, 9 out of 10 people suspected of murders, they weren't even charged. In Russia alone, 300 deaths and disappearances have been counted between 1993 and 2009. The International Federation of Journalists keeps these figures. Now, we've all heard of Anna Politkovskaya from Novaya Gazeta. Nobody yet convicted of her murder. Well, you haven't heard of the hundreds more. And most of the time, deaths of these Russian journalists not even investigated properly. Now, the Committee to Protect Journalists keeps a list of those it says there's firm evidence to say were murdered. And just a couple of examples from 2010. They've got 3 murdered journalists in Honduras, a couple in Nigeria, a couple in Indonesia, others in Somalia, Angola, Pakistan, Rwanda, Yemen, Mexico. I could go on. Already 10 Mexican journalists murdered this year alone. And you don't have to murder journalists to keep them quiet. It's also easy to jail them, gets them out of the way. So Iran, this year alone, has jailed 170 journalists and bloggers. At the moment, there's 37 of them in prison. In Turkey, there's Vedat Kursan, the biggest shareholder in a Kurdish language Turkish paper. He's now facing up to 525 years in jail for stories seen as pro-Kurdish. So what can we do about all this? Well, the good news is, I'm not here just to upset you. I want you to know you can do something positive to fight this scandal. You can right these wrongs. You can expose these injustices. You can save lives. You can keep reporters out of jail. You can prevent editors from being abducted and tortured. It's very easy. It comes down to one beautiful tool that the internet and the social networks have given us. Simply by being part of this global communications network, we're all investigative reporters now. The one weapon we have is the power to spread the truth across all sorts of platforms. The ability to publicize injustice, to engage people with what's happening, to tell stories, to shine that light. So let's tell stories about these journalists. Let's raise the volume on their work. Let's show people the risks they're taking just to tell the truth, so that they're no longer invisible and anonymous and easily wiped out. Let's amplify what they're daring to do by making their own governments and politicians and police forces know that strangers in Geneva or in London or in New York are paying attention. Well, that's a bit inconvenient, isn't it? So your role and mine, I think we need to engage our wider networks with the stories these reporters, these editors are telling. Give them that global platform. Because if we're the spotlight, that helps protect them when they're taking great risks to inform about what's going on. We need to think of creative ways to amplify what's happening from Iran to Indonesia. So yes, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, we've got blogs, we've got video blogs. There's augmented reality games. There's interactive apps. There's online narratives. There's all sorts of other multimedia experiences. It's about telling stories in whichever ways can reach more people than the local newspaper or radio station. It means most simply spreading this news through our friends' networks. So that when, for instance, there are food riots in places like Mozambique and Maputo, local journalists, Eric Charas, who runs a weekly paper, Jornal o Verdade, and he created a Facebook page. He created a Twitter hashtag, Maputo Riots. 7 people had been killed before many outsiders got to know what was going on. This is his Facebook page. He put video online. So he tweeted, "This video is hard to believe. A man shooting at rioters at the street below from the office of the ruling party in Maputo." So it helped that he tweeted in English. The word got around, other people retweeted it. News agencies, CNN, France 24, they started investigating. It became no longer a local event, it became an international story. So spread the word. Show what's happening behind closed doors in Mexico City or in Minsk. In our globally connected world, I think we have a responsibility to do that. It's easier than ever for local people, not just journalists, to get those stories out there. So obviously there's WikiLeaks for documents, but there's Global Voices, there's Sahara Reporters, there's CitizenTube, there's Periodismo Ciudadano. There's Witness.org that puts videos online. Its motto, see it, film it, change it. Because you can change the story by responding to it, by engaging. And by carrying that story further, you are protecting that journalist. So am I being stupidly naive? Do we really care about what's happening on the other side of the world? To look at a lot of our mainstream Western media, you wouldn't think so. There's only 4 American newspapers now which even have a foreign desk, according to the website Demotics. But I think we do care. And I think the social networks, they let us get involved in new ways. Just look at the number of retweets during the Iranian election. So play your role. Be engaged. Spread the word. Your participation can change the world. Be a hero. Thank you.